engage in that thought experiment too.
Now, just to, Architecture 142, a book we just read, this first year was Waterland. And what's Waterland? It's a story about a guy and something really bad happens in his life. That is, his wife comes home with a child she has kidnapped. Yeah, and suddenly this guy is the husband of the baby snatcher of whatever. And what does he do? He starts telling a story. I mean, that was Graham Swift's idea, that the first, in some way, before we do anything else, you started to tell a story. You started to tell a story. I didn't know this. And it's good, because I was thinking also there will be many people now who say shit, and they will feel frightened or anxious and not know how other people will look at them. And I think it's important that, and I trusted this community. I mean, I know this community relatively well. One of the great things about our interview process is that you're here because we want you to be here. We as a community. So I generally have the feeling that there are not many assholes in this school. Yeah? And that I can trust this group to have actually the response to each other and to be able to give that collective hug to you and you, because we know you need it, and that's why I called the meeting. More than anything else, because I think you need to be able to articulate your anxiety, and we need to be able to say, okay, I can't guarantee what happens outside on the street right now, but here you're safe. And here we'll try to understand you. And here we'll say shit with you, you know. I'm very good at that, as you probably know. So
in 5 languages.
In 5 languages, yes, yeah. So, and then once we've settled amongst ourselves that we know where we stand, I mean, we stand certainly not with the assholes, and we might be confused, we might be standing confusedly, and then maybe we can do something as a community and feel that that also is going to be part of the story of who we are.
Hi.
So, going back to what Donald was saying about...
You know what? Even with the microphone, you have to speak up.
So this idea of hijacking I thought was really interesting. And I think it can also link into the question that Safira was asking, which is what do we do? And I think to a certain extent, we can't allow it to distract us, because all of these isolated instances create a state of distraction where we lose sight of the larger issues that cause these singular instances. I was also thinking about what's going to happen with the climate summit in Paris. The whole week before the attacks, I was watching Olafur Eliasson is pulling pieces of melting glacier to Paris as an art installation. And I kind of thought, well, how is this going to change the impact of this gathering? And so I think taking maybe what's happened and seeing it as not saying that's right, but that in order to change it, we have to change the larger issues that are causing it, is maybe a way of addressing the issue. It's just a thought I had.
Certainly commentary this morning on the CBC would say in Belgium and France, you're going to get really unhappy young men with 40% unemployment among the non-white population. So yeah, and that's in fact not our problem, I hope, in any case. But it's definitely theirs, and as somebody said, you don't want this to happen again, start to share the prosperity, you know, and that's, which I would actually say is probably a wise move under any condition. If you want peace, share the prosperity, and don't be niggling about it. But yeah, but I think also the trick is, how would you share? I don't think we can change the economic profile of Belgium or France, or even Canada. So how do you do this as an individual and collectively? I think that's an important thing to understand.
We had a question up there.
Somebody else waiting before me.
Go.
Okay. I want to say that upon hearing your words, Philip, I started to feel, and I think it was on the line about standing on a ground which you start to imagine as being actually crystalline and perhaps about to descend into tempest or waves. You know, I felt, you know, a pretty deep-seated sense of kind of fear in my stomach, like very heavy, as we've all mentioned many times, you know, your gut clenching. And oftentimes when these kind of things happen, because they happen so much now, the terrorist attacks, whether they're in Paris or, you know, somewhere in Africa, in Mali, I think to myself, you know, because most of us in this room are probably born after or at the end of the Cold War, I think to myself, you know, what's the big existential threat of our generation? Because we all know it's not terrorism. And I think back to your generations where, you know, every day you're living under the threat of nuclear annihilation. And I often ask myself, and I've never asked somebody of your generation this, but is the fear that you might have felt then at the height of the Cold War, at certain hot parts of the Cold War, the same like kind of fear you feel in response to Paris or in response to 9/11?
Can I say, I had a mother who had a nervous breakdown over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I didn't give a shit. You know, I was perfectly, I don't know what anybody else thinks, but I was perfectly confident they'd work it out because mutually assured destruction is a real deterrent. And I think I understood that when I was 8. My mother didn't seem to understand that, so she did have a breakdown. She just like lost her shit completely. And it was rough being around it, but you kind of go, Ma, what's the problem? They're not going to do it. They're only minutes away from confrontation. No. You know, somebody might sink somebody else's submarine, end of story. They might have a real argument for a while, but, you know, they've been through Korea. You know, if they didn't have it over Korea, they're not going to have it. So I think it was the most colossal piece of, you know, Dwight Eisenhower, who was hardly a perfect person, but was probably one of the most interestingly quiet American presidents. Anybody wants to see something interesting, you go on YouTube, and I think you will find it somewhere on the line, because I've seen it, I've watched it a dozen times, his speech on leaving the presidency. And what he says is, there is this thing that has emerged in this country. It is a complex of industry and the military. They seek to take control of this country, and we all have to be vigilant against this complex. He coins the word military-industrial complex, and he, as the guy who planned D-Day and, you know, the invasion of Europe in '44, says, don't believe the generals, don't believe the arms manufacturers, and don't believe any of these congressmen selling you an arms deal. As near as I could see, there may have been a lot of anxiety around. I certainly didn't feel any. I don't know.
Well, I mean, what you're saying though, Donald, I mean, it's the same thing, right? 9/11 and this huge alarmist thing about world terrorism in the face of global warming is the same thing, right? It's the military-industrial complex, and they're still trying to scare us with something.
Well,
It
the
sounds like the same
interesting
situation
thing
in
about
a very different
9/11
way.
was after I finished with Robert, I went over and spent the day with a woman who's a friend of mine whose husband was in the building, and then went to my daughter's school to deal with all of the fallout there, because there were 3 fathers who had business in that building that day. They all lived, but that was real anxiety. It's like, you know, wow, where are these guys? Because no one knew for a day, because nothing worked. They had to walk out. It wasn't until they were up until past Central Park that they could get a phone that would work or anything like that. That was worrying. That was horribly worrying. But that was people you knew. It's like you know, it's just like a guy I'd spent a lot of time with or something like that. That's real. That's tangible for me. The abstraction is not. So, you understand immediately the Iraq War was just deplorable. It was deplorable from zero.
I think that I would like to respond to a little different angle. I mean, I think that each of us has a storehouse of beautiful experiences, of really, in some way a bank of stuff where we can fall back on. I was very touched by Philip's presentation. It was very unexpected, I have to say. And I'm happy at times to disagree with my friend and colleague Philip, but in this case, I was actually touched because what Philip shared with you was that in this what is his life and has become your life, which is architecture, that he actually found in that experience in his storehouse of Piero della Francesco and Mies van der Rohe's National Gallery, he found in some way the raw material to start working this out and to create a story, to create that story that we start to create meaning out of confusion, to create a line. I turned 60 in August, and my wife gave me a trip to Tofino. And I thought, Tofino, who cares about Tofino? I'm not a surfer. I mean, it's all for young people, and I hate basically Emily Carr's paintings of these really ugly trees. They're really ugly. And I spent the day of my 60th birthday whale watching on a little Zodiac. We went out. There were at least 8 people on this Zodiac. It was not a crazy thing that sank, and we went out and first saw the otters, and then we saw the sea lions, and then we saw the seals, and then finally we saw whales. And the whales were fantastic. I had never believed that whales could be that fantastic. We're very close to them. They go up, they go down. You're in the breath of the whale when they exhale. Yeah, and so close to this animal, this animal which is so much larger than the whole boat. 10 times as large as the boat, and goes down, and it comes up, and another whale comes in. And I was completely, utterly already in a parallel universe. I mean, I was in a magical world, because of these big whales playing around. I mean, having a dinner there. And then we went back, and it was a long trip back, and then there was suddenly this eagle over us, this bald eagle. And then finally we arrived back, and we made a walk through the rainforest. And the rainforest is, it's fantastic, it's magical. I mean, the sound of it, the texture of it. And in the past days, I've been revisiting that in order not to go crazy. I'm thinking a lot about that whale. Yeah. And I think that all of us need to identify also, right now, where is that whale that allows us to believe that, the world may be out of control, but the whales are still out there, and creating that sense of nature, in some way also having its own life, as far as we allow it today, and be of a very different magnitude than our little concerns. And ultimately, these are little concerns when seen from Mars.
Sorry. So not to reiterate, I guess, some of the things that were said earlier, but when I first, and also not to seem insensitive, but when I first heard of the attacks happening in Paris, I think I felt this fear that a lot of other people felt, but also like a fear from the opposite perspective, where earlier this year when I spent some time in Europe, I noticed there was a very strong sense of xenophobia, more so than I anticipated, and it was a lot more in the face than I expected, because here in Canada it's sort of like we have this idea that we welcome immigrants, we're a multicultural society, and they're sort of like, there's this idea of like, oh, but they're different. And so I don't know if this is as much a question or a statement, but what do you say to those people when they say they're different? Because I know this past election there was the whole issue being raised of like the old stock Canadians and people who've been here for longer generations, and sort of this idea of like whether or not you belong. So I guess my question is, what do we say then?
Did you notice that the guy who was talking about the old stock Canadians and being a bitch about the niqab lost his ass Yeah, I think one of the great things about it is that an enormous amount of the election turned on that and did something he didn't expect, which I think was that, and it was on those things, you know. So I think that's one of the first things. In Europe, it's a different story, you know. Of course, it's a different story. It's like, you probably don't look at, what's the name of the Battle of Algiers. It's not Pontecorvo, is it? The film Battle of Algiers, nobody's seen it, right?
Yeah, but
No.
I forgot to make it.
You forgot, huh?
I forgot who made it, so.
I think it's Pontecorvo, but I'm not sure. I'm sure it's Pontecorvo. It's worth seeing. Battle of Algiers is the story of the Foreign Legion losing Algeria to the population of Algeria. And the French Foreign Legion is really tough. They were really bad. It's a story that my friend John Van Nostrand said the first time he saw it. He said, I just went home and wept. I couldn't stop. Tribalism doesn't go away in a generation or a nation. So yeah, people get tribal. One of the things that I keep finding as I sort of research for the book I'm working on is just how many hundreds of peoples there are in the nations of Europe. How, you know, just like, you know, France has 24 languages and 6 peoples, and Spain has more, and Germany has more, and they sort of know it, but they kind of pretend to be blind to it when they're talking about their nation. Their civilization is hard won, and it's thin. I believe in some sense it's thin. America's civilization is hard won and it's thinner. That's completely clear. But I think that's always going to be there. I could only repeat one story, and this is going to seem completely out of place, but it's the only one that I actually understand. My daughter, who's about the same age as most of the people here, is like the least racist person I know who's still white, right? And she went to school at Columbia, and she gets really rangy if she doesn't have a lot of physical exercise, so she would run. And her parents made a rule, which is to say, you're not running in the city alone. You know, so she would just sign up and have running partners, and they would run everywhere. And she would sort of run all over the city, and then I get these phone calls saying, Battery City, so much more amazing than I would have thought. And then she phoned up one day and said, Dad, I feel like shit. I feel like this is really crazy. He said, well, I was running up Harlem, and I've run up Harlem a lot, but this time I realized I'm with this guy. I realized we're the only 2 white people on the street. And am I supposed to feel guilty? Like, should I feel badly for realizing that? I said, no, that's a fact. You know, you just noticed. And now you know what your black friends feel like most of the time, okay? Like, you know, the only person who's not white in the room. She said, okay. And I said, the other thing to remember is, I know you're not a racist. There's nothing about you that is a racist. But the thing to remember inside of that is that you can actually not be a racist, but be aware that they are potentially around you. And keep your head in that. And I think that's the only way that I think it works, is in some sense to say, cosmopolitanism, as we understand it, is a philosophy that says the boundaries of the city are broken down, the walls are gone, and we are all one, is barely a century old. The walls of Vienna went down only a century ago. When the walls go down, everybody's included in the city, but just barely, only a century old for the sort of sense of the cosmopolis, that we're all citizens. I find...
Just ask a question that follows on that, because the word being cosmopolitan seems like a tremendously enabling one, but I'd be very interested to know how you are feeling as in terms of being located. is it possible to say that you are in a nation? And is it possible to draw comfort from that term? Nationalism, the nation. When you're lonely, or when you are unhappy, or when you're in need, who do you turn to? And how do you identify yourself? I should say we or I. Do you turn to your family? Do you circle the wagons? Do you think about your community? Do you think about your nation? Some of the thoughts that have been aired tonight have offered, I think, or suggested that we draw comfort. Our school. It's special here. You belong here. We should bring someone into our great nation and take care of them here as an act of perhaps collective strength and generosity. It strikes me that those kinds of thoughts are founded very strongly on a sense of nationhood, in whatever scale that means. And I do wonder about the viability of that term when I think with the tremendous ambivalence of what acting on nationhood and enforcing nationhood and protecting nationhood and fighting for nationhood fuels. I'm just very curious about your own sense of how good and true and generous and viable those terms are today.
In the meantime,
Okay, I think it is very important to have a sense of place when you talk about safety. To kind of juxtapose what we've been talking about here about how our nation, our school, our place is safe, and we want to bring somebody into it, and we see this as kind of like, even though we've been talking about dropping the borders, that we really have created borders in that sense. If we are seeing these awful acts mostly as we attribute them mostly to the Islamic State, the Islamic State is a state, it is a place. And I think it is comforting and maybe even it is important to see our place, not necessarily Canada, but our world as a different place that has borders, that you can actually physically cross from somewhere unsafe into somewhere safe. And even to think about how everyone has been responding to this by first off telling us where they were when they heard the news. They're telling us about their place, and as humans, I think it is very important to have that, and to, if we are taking refugees in, to not just say, oh, you're coming into safety, but you're coming into Canada. And Canada, we need to maintain that narrative of what that place means to us, and then what it would eventually mean to them. So I think nationality in that sense, nationality or even like a more global nationality, like the Western world or something, I mean, not necessarily that, but is important.
But about safety, I talked to my mother-in-law, who's 93 years old, on Saturday. And she lives in Florida, and she's seen a lot. Lived through the Second World War in Germany, married an Auschwitz survivor. And she just, cheerfully did try to remind Miriam and myself of the fact that the likelihood that we will die falling in our bathtub at home is much higher than being killed by a terrorist. So home, what is the safety of home? We can also ask that. I mean, there is a, in a sense, of course, the final reserve, which we have the luxury of being able to use right now, is that we actually have may have a sense of humor about it too. Yeah? We can have, because as far as I know, none of us was directly touched. But even people who are touched by this and who survived it, ultimately also will learn to live with it. And we live with the fact that we might die I might die tonight in my bathtub. I certainly will take a bath later tonight because it does help me relax.
He likes to live adventurously.
Hey, and when I go down in the bathtub and you don't want to think about it, I really can imagine that whale again. So now I just wonder, we've done this we've talked for 2 hours, and I think we can continue very long. But I think that how many people still want to talk? That's my major thing right now. 2. Okay, so everyone who's raised their hand right now, they can talk, and then we might bring this to an end. Yes.
I think this has been glossed over, and I don't want to make everyone afraid, but we have to remember, 1 year ago, almost exactly, someone walked out to Parliament Hill and started shooting. Right? We aren't exactly untouched in this, but the difference in that situation from Paris is that immediately afterwards, maybe it's because we lost 1 soldier instead of dozens of civilians, but immediately after that, our response, the news was flooded, not with talks about closing the doors, because this person was a national, this person was Canadian, but people started going to his history about how he was down in his luck, had drug problems, had maybe even mental health problems. And the narrative that came directly after the Ottawa attack was that these people who feel shunned from our society, even in Canada, are turning towards radicalism. And I think it would be greatly contradictory if in the face of that our greatest threat seems to come from people that we're excluding, that our reaction is then to further exclude people.
I'm going to throw in one thing, so I'm going to introduce a term, because I think that was very astute except for one word, which was radicalism. Nothing about that goes on as radical, but I do think that there is a term that was used by the left very, very well in the 60s and 70s, which is vanguardism. It's a notion that I'm way out in front and I am going to show you by my heroic, that is to say in brackets, narcissistic activities, what should really happen. I will provoke something. And it's what was interesting in in the sort of left-wing circle that I understood, that I was sort of a part of. Vanguardism was contemptible. It was deplorable. Vanguardism was that thing where you didn't go to the demonstration, you picked a fight with the police because that would make your point better. It proved you're willing to be in the vanguard. You're going to risk your body for these things. And I think actually that it's one of the most interesting denunciations. I think the sense of a radical seems to be reasonable. That's someone who's struggling to find a route to something. It's misplaced because I don't think there are roots to things in the end. But vanguard is something else, and I think your remarks are very good. But for that, I think the term you really want to use is actually that one, because I think radical is perfectly appropriate. Vanguard is in some sense kind of contemptible for exactly that reason, that all you do is lead other people into destructive situations. You provoke things that are completely unnecessary. Yeah. So.
Well, I think it's really easy to have an idea and then to actually make it happen and go through with it. Like, for example, Professor, you said that we need, what can we do? And you said, well, we can buy them a boat. But these people need more than just a boat. They need jobs when they arrive here, and they need facilities. They need all these other complicated issues, And especially in Europe right now, it's like that's what they're facing. European countries are not taking these immigrants in, these refugees, just because there's no space, and also economical reasons, which is obviously a very big, huge portion of this. I mean, you can say Canada, we're a great country, but even our First Nations, we don't treat that well. Let's say, for example, in North Quebec, where there's First Nation community, like right beside the lake, and they're isolated. Government doesn't help them that much. They all have problems like with drugs. They all have they beat their women and stuff like that, and so they have a lot of social problems in that community, and they live in Canada. Now, what I think about the future, and I'm really scared for Syrians. They're completely terrorized. These people mentally are unstable anymore. Kids are growing up looking at dead people on the street, and like even if they would move to other countries, like Freud's theory, the subconscious is always there. Trauma causes all these problems, and it'll come out one way or the other, and they're going to raise their children having that in their heads, and their children are going to be raised like that. But same thing with like ISIS members. Their children are going to be raised thinking that being a sociopath is okay. So it's just like the psychological factors, I think, are a really big issue. And the only solution to this, I think, is educating people. But especially once that mentality is there, like for example with the ISIS group and their kids, it's really hard to take out. Like it's planted in them, That's all I want to say.
But there has been, let's be honest, we do have, and it's strange for me to invoke a Christian concept maybe, but we have to accept that there is something like conversion. We have to accept that hope is never going, that well of hope is never going to be dry. We do know that child soldiers in Africa, children who've been taught to kill at the age of 5, and they don't know anything, boys, than to kill and to kill and to kill and to kill. That also they can be taken out of it, and that they can actually be shown that there's another way to live. We have experience with that. So in some way, yes, it will be, in some way, ultimately the definition of courage is that we face our fears. And of course, the fears are legitimate, and they're rational. And then at a certain moment, we have to make, as a society, and big society, small society, individually, a calculation that in some way hope will trump. Because if we don't have hope, I do not really know how I can get up in the morning. Yeah, and hope has risks, and it is, and sometimes we're going to be betrayed by it. But I think that the idea that and it also goes to the other side. It goes with you. You get the best education possible. I mean, you have the privilege of listening to us here. And let me tell you, some of you turn out very, very badly. Yeah? And you all forget about your ICO lessons and whatever. No, but so it is in some way we are going back to this idea that there is free will, and that ultimately, until the moment that we die, no one of us is lost, I think. And that is something I think all great religions, all of what humanism ultimately teaches us, so that we don't give up on that. It might be harder, and it might be more frightening for us, certainly more frightening for those young men who have grown up in that world. But I think we have to try it. And I don't really know how to do it yet, but certainly if Donald tells me that he's going to, if he asks me, join me in this effort, I trust him enough to say, okay, yeah, we're in it together, and then maybe Anne will join, and Philip will join, and then we're 4 of us, we give each other courage. And then when you join, we give each other courage. So I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. Face our fears, be rational, and then at a certain moment, make a jump into the unknown.
Just another dimension, maybe that's another obvious one, but I'm thinking back of one of the films that we're showing this year in also the cultural history class, the Our Music by Godard, where it's very much, based on the Divine Comedy by Dante, but it goes from Inferno, and everything is really foregrounding the violence, the wars, the mutual hatred between people, and then trying. So it starts with that image, in some ways what we've been facing on Friday, But then the purgatory, which is life, in which, this time of the pilgrim, is really also trying to focus. I mean, on the one hand, yes, stories, film, narratives, writing, but also I think overall this idea of the communication, and where a number of issues, I think in your intervention, there were many elements to it, and I think there's something that's also Philip was pointing to in terms of nationhood or nation and boundaries, which of course it's always who's included, who's excluded. I think there's that dimension of it, and also is everyone within it the same, and you're raising the issues of First Nations and how much we keep the communication open and how much of an equal communication is it. But I think, going back to, yes, hope, but I think this notion that we must engage in discussion. There must be that space where we stand as well, but the table around which we can sit and come for a discussion. So that would be my hope, that actually that space of communication is maintained and kept and not closed off and made only for the select few or those who belong, but actually everyone is invited at the table.
So I would suggest, sir, you want more? Last person, okay, so, yeah, yes.
So I called Europe my home until I got here to Canada for university, and I was in Vienna when all those refugees were walking down the highway in thousands of masses to the border, trying to save themselves from this terror that they experienced at home. And I found it amazing that it was not the government that opened the arms into Austria, it was the people. So it was from one human being to another human being that, they opened their doors, opened their houses, provided food, gave all these necessities, and helped them move on further through Europe. It was then not a government initiative, it was something that people wanted to do. And now I find it absolutely disgraceful and horrible that an act of fear, an act of terror, has allowed this human-to-human connection to suddenly be broken. Because I know Austria has closed their doors to the refugees. They have made a border which there aren't even by EU laws supposed to have. And I just find it a really, hard thing, that something I was proud of, that the people of my country, of my home, extended their hands and their thoughts and feelings. And now that they retracted this, and that everybody is, the refugees are to blame, the refugees brought the terror from their home, which they're fleeing from, to the terror in our country now. And I just wanted to say that this is not something that, this feeling of fear should not be supported, it should be fought, and that this kindness should overcome this, that people should once again open up their homes, because the refugees, they're still at the border, they're still going to be there, they're going to come more and more. And what are we going to say? We're going to leave you there out in the open? I just want to have people remember that it's not okay to say, well, we're the lucky ones. We were the refugees before we escaped from a world war. We escaped from Yugoslavian war. We escaped from all these different places. And just because we escaped first, we have the right to say, no, you can't come here. So I just want to throw that out as a perspective of someone who was at home when this happened, when these people came. And I saw, and my family helped, my friends helped, my people, my country, my nation, the whole of Europe helped. And I find that now that this fear has come, that this has broken down, and I would really like to encourage that we should once again, open ourselves up to courage that we can overcome this fear that a couple of people have managed to instill in a whole country, in a whole European nation, and everyone beyond that, because people here in Canada start feeling scared about something that is, for them, over an ocean. But maybe it's because suddenly it's not that far away anymore. Suddenly it's not in the television news, which they can say, that's somewhere in the Middle East, that's somewhere in Africa. Maybe now that it has now come to Europe, in this sense, it has come to America before, it has come to Canada also as well before, but maybe it hits a bit harder because Europe has opened their doors. Maybe that's why, I'm not sure. I'm just trying to figure it out myself, because I'm in a hard spot where I'm ashamed of what Europe is right now doing and closing off and condemning people. But it's just, I can also understand why, but I think it's a bad feeling to have this fear, and that people should not let this fear dictate their humanity.
But I think people will push back. I mean, history is messy. We know that. Yeah? We take 2 steps forwards, we take 2 steps backwards, sometimes 3 steps backwards, we go 4 steps forward. It's always a seesaw kind of thing. Ultimately it seems that we learn a few things along the way. So I think that in some way you have to remember it's a little bit a whale. Yeah? I'm thinking of my whale. For God's sake, think about that moment when everyone basically came out of their houses and welcomed them. And then in some way try also, I would say, be charitable. Try to understand that the fears are also real. So in some way, I try to think of my best me, and there are very not so best me's too, when I feel down. And in some way, I would say for your own sake, think of the Austrians at their best. And in some way think, okay, they're not doing that great right now. But I presume at a certain moment they will remember how it felt when they were not afraid. And then maybe at a certain moment they will be like that again. And maybe a little bit more than the time before. And maybe the way they fall back into fear the next time will be a little less than it's happening now. And that, I think, is the way when I don't really believe there's that much progress in the world, but whatever progress is, it is like this. So, certainly, when I grew up, when I was your age, I was sitting in a classroom of white males. There were not even women. Yeah? Women only went to university to find a husband. So they're only there in the first 2 years. Women did not get university educations in the Netherlands. Yeah? Look where we are now. Yeah? So, and I feel very happy that as a white male, I'm here in the minority in this room. I call that progress. So.
I feel very happy as a white male that I haven't been eaten.
Donald, not my taste. Okay, shall we, you want to say something or shall we just, I think.
One thing to say, Vienna, consider yourself hugged. Consider yourself hugged.
Yeah? Okay. Thanks very much for coming. This will not be the end of the conversation, I think.